Well, welcome to our workshop as part of the New York State Association of Conservation Commission's annual conference. This is our workshop on an update on the Climate Action Council process and where that stands and where that's going. And we have four great members of the Climate Action Council to give their perspective on where we are. And I'm going to maybe take a breath for a second and let more people log in and join us, but this is certainly one of the most important things that is going on right now is the Climate Action Council, the scoping plan that really is the roadmap for New York State to meet our climate goals that were established in the 2019 legislation. And I'm very pleased that we have an exceptional panel of members of the Climate Action Council who all have a history with environmental issues and the environmental community, really a great group. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a brief introduction of all four of our speakers at the top, and then we'll move through it. And we're going to begin with Professor Robert Howarth of Cornell University. And the professor, I'd say Cornell is actually too small a word to describe the footprint that Bob gives to the environmental community.
Hello, everyone. When you are returning from the Zoom, I'll wait a second to make sure everyone's connected. When you are returning from the Zoom, if you find yourself stuck as it goes,
maybe we can mute the instruction person.
See anyone else, or you're transparent, please feel free to just refresh your browser. That will correct this bug. We've already contacted Gather about the bug, and they know about it, but we do not have a timeline when we'll fix it. So again, when you come back from the Zoom, just refresh your browser, and that'll take care of it. Thanks very much, and we'll see you in the workshop sessions that are starting 2 minutes ago.
Sorry for that interruption. Professor Howarth is David Atkinson Professor of Ecology and Environmental Biology at Cornell, but he is known worldwide and cited worldwide for his work on emissions, the human impact on our activities on climate change, and is a real thought leader, and he is going to be leading off. He will be followed by Raya Salter, who is an adjunct professor at the Cardozo Law School, but is also the founder and executive director of the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center, which is a very innovative assembly of lawyers to try and problem solve some of these climate change issues at a community level, bring some legal resources in terms of problem solving. And she is a leader on the internet and otherwise in educating everyone about these climate justice issues and climate change issues. We have Gavin Donohue, who is the president and CEO of the Independent Power Producers of New York, a trade association. Gavin has done a great job representing that community, and in his prior life, he was executive deputy commissioner of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and he is also an active member of the New York State Climate Action Council. And the last speaker on this panel is going to be Peter Iwanowicz, who is executive director of Environmental Advocates, which is a very respected group in Albany lobbying on the environment. But Peter brings a long resume, was with Environmental Advocates years ago, but also served in the Spitzer and Patterson administrations in the governor's office, and was acting commissioner of DEC for a stint. And so we have four speakers that bring tremendous knowledge and are interacting with each other and the other 18 members of the Climate Action Council. So the goal of this workshop is to have each of them provide a perspective about where we are, where we're going, what the challenges are, what the obstacles are. And so each of you has 10 minutes, and then we'll have some interactive conversation at the end. We have until 1:55. Professor Howarth, the floor is yours, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Steve, both for that introduction and also for your leadership in getting the CLCPA through. I also want to acknowledge Steve Englebright's huge role in that and my former Assemblyperson Barbara Lifton's role in passing that legislation. Steve's introduced what the Climate Action Council is. It's a group of 22 of us established by law under the CLCPA, the climate law of 2019. It's got 12 members who are appointed by the positions they hold as part of the statute. And then there are 10 of us who are appointed in other ways. I'm one of the individuals appointed by the Speaker of the Assembly, Carl Heastie. The council's charged by law with coming up with a draft scoping plan. That is a blueprint for how to implement the policies and goals that are stated in the CLCPA. The law stipulated that we have a draft of that scoping plan as of last December, and we did. I think it's a fine plan. We put out for public comment, held a lot of hearings, got a tremendous amount of written comments, and we and the supporting staff for the council have been going through those and taking it very seriously. So I want to thank the public for that input. There are a lot of different pieces of the CLCPA and the Climate Action Council plan, a lot of different goals. Environmental justice is a key part of that. I'm not going to speak to that. Raya Salter will come on next, and I'm sure she will highlight that. I just want to point to a couple of goals. The law calls for 70% of all electricity generation in the state be renewable by 2030, 7.5 years from now, and 100% carbon-free electricity across the board by 2040. The entire New York economy has to be carbon neutral by 2050. But to me, one of the most exciting and important goals is that we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions statewide by 40% by 2030, again, just 7.5 years from now, all economic sectors. And for context on that, the CLCPA also sets up a new form of greenhouse gas accounting. New York banned fracking quite a while ago, and yet our use of fossil gas has continued to rise in this state faster than any other state. And it's mostly all shale gas from Pennsylvania and other states. Huge greenhouse gas emissions associated with that. So the CLCPA mandates that we take responsibility for those emissions, even though they occur out of state. They wouldn't be occurring if we weren't using the gas. And so it sets a responsibility which helps shape our thinking on the Climate Action Council. And using that new accounting, it turns out that the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions in our state is the energy that's used in buildings, homes and commercial buildings, primarily for heating, both space heating and water heating. I'm going to focus on buildings in the few short minutes I have here. Transportation is a big issue, and we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, but under federal law, we really are hand-tied somewhat. We can't do more than what either the EPA allows or what the state of California allows, and we're being as progressive as we can under California's model. For housing, though, this is a unique issue for New York. We can't look to California or other states. Our emissions, it's a colder climate, our emissions are a lot larger, and we really need to pioneer a new approach. One of the things that's in our draft climate action scoping plan, and I think will be in our final plan, is a ban on fossil fuels in new home construction as of 2030. So just 2024, excuse me, just 15 months out from here. I think there's absolutely no reason to allow fossil fuels in new home construction to proceed. Currently, it is less expensive to build a new home in New York that's heated with heat pumps than using fossil fuels. And of course, the maintenance costs and the energy costs are far less. But simply dealing with new construction won't get us to where we need to go. There are some 6 million homes, single-family homes across the state that heat currently with fossil fuels, about 2/3 of those with natural gas, but a lot with fuel oil and propane as well. And we need to retrofit those. That's one of the biggest challenges we face. In terms of homes that are currently heating with fuel oil or propane, it's actually cost effective for anyone in the state to make that switch now. I've done so in my own house from where I'm speaking today. We did it 6 years ago with a ground source heat pump. We've paid off that investment already. Natural gas is trickier because natural gas has been so underpriced. But with the steep rise in natural gas prices, with the payback period is coming down. Nonetheless, there are large upfront capital costs for this conversion. And one of the big challenges to us in the council, one of the big challenges for the state, is to find funding mechanisms to help individuals with that upfront cost of this transition. I want to also say that the draft scoping plan, as we have it, calls for reducing our use of natural gas statewide by 30% by 2030 and by half by 2035 pretty quickly. And so the natural gas industry is going to look very different pretty quickly into our future. And we've been spending a lot of time on the council talking about what that means in terms of the future of the gas distribution pipeline. And I think we are in agreement that the pipeline system must be downsized and must be done in an orderly, structured way. Otherwise, the transition is going to be extremely expensive, dangerous, and also polluting. So we're working out the details of how to do that, and I can answer some questions on it. I think I'm probably getting towards my 10 minutes. Am I, Steve?
You actually have, I'd say, 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes. All right, let me just give you an example of what we're talking about in terms of the structured downsizing of the gas pipeline system. If we simply leave it to individual homeowners across the state to decide when to cut the tie from fossil fuels and do that in sort of a willy-nilly piecemeal fashion, it will be pretty expensive. So in order to both make the transition safer and reduce the methane emissions as we do so, and more cost effective for everyone involved, the utilities, but homeowners as well, it probably makes sense to convert whole neighborhoods at a time, moving them, say, off of a gas infrastructure and towards renewable heating. So those are the sorts of issues we're still talking about in the plan. The final plan will be out in December. All 4 of us, as well as all of the other 18 members on the council, have been meeting an incredible amount over the summer. And I think we're close to reaching a pretty strong consensus on what I feel will be a very strong plan. The one thing I do want to say is that I think there's a lot of confusion out there in the public that shows up in some of the comments we received on the plan. Part of that is just because it's a confusing area. Part of it's because there is some misinformation and disinformation out there. So I think a real priority for the council and for the state has got to be, as we come out with our final plan, to have a orderly education plan, getting out the messages. The plan is good for the state. It's good for the state's economy. It's going to be good for everyone, certainly good for public health as well as climate. And we need to make sure everyone understands that. This plan is not going to bankrupt the state. It's going to help the state, but we need to effectively convey that to all. And I'm delighted to be able to talk to this group today because, of course, you're all influential people in your community, and I'm hoping you can convey this message back. So thanks for the opportunity to talk with you, and I'll turn the mic over to Raya, my colleague.
Raya, the floor is yours. Welcome aboard. Nice to see you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Gavin. Thank you, Peter. Thanks everyone for being here. Steve, you are such, as our local representative, you are there in Albany, you were there in person when we need you. So just thank you. Thank you for that. So I will share my screen and I've got a short presentation. There are so many, all right, this is always the part that I don't get smooth, the actual move over to the slideshow. So there's so many aspects of this, of this plan. And I did want to focus today on the idea of disadvantaged communities under our New York law and what is the current funding looking like for disadvantaged communities, frontline communities, and environmental justice. So Steve introduced me. My name is Raya Salter. I am an attorney and educator and founding executive director of the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center. My background is as an energy attorney, first in private practice in New York City, and then with groups like the Environmental Defense Fund and the NRDC. Most recently, the New York Renews Climate Justice Coalition, the authors and the folks who really powered through our climate law. So I like to say that as I introduce myself. What are we? EJLPC is a new organization. We're really the nation's first public interest law firm focused on energy justice. Imagine that, making the connection between people and power. I will also say, just because a few weeks ago, I've had some viral fame that you may or may not have seen. I went to testify before the Oversight Committee and had an interesting experience with Representative Clay Higgins from Louisiana, who was trying to hide the ball on what petrochemicals and big oil are doing to damage the folks in Louisiana. It kind of blew up viral. Tucker Carlson chimed in at one point. Go ahead and follow me at Climate Auntie on Instagram. If you like, you can consider me your Climate Auntie. If you want to hear more about all that skirmish, and really to Bob's point about misinformation, it really is the API and fossil fuel industry playbook to work to undermine our clean energy transitions at all levels, including here in New York. All right, so we talked a bit about our law, the CLCPA. Yes, it's one of the nation's most ambitious state climate laws. It has a lot of innovative provisions. I won't speak to all of them. What I'll get to is a little bit of the provisions that relate to energy, environmental, and climate justice. The one I want to zero in on here, because we're talking about funding, is this idea of the Justice 40. All right, so the New York law says that a goal of 40% and no less than 35% of the benefits of the state's climate spending must benefit so-called disadvantaged communities. This is a climate justice concept of how do we prioritize investment into the communities that need it most and have been historically targeted for disinvestment. Now, what we do on the state level is incredibly influential. The Biden administration really borrowed this idea. We were the state president. And so there is also a federal initiative that's running in parallel called the Justice 40. It's an executive order. And it also says that 40% of benefits must go to disadvantaged communities. There's a lot to say about how that's playing out, what that looks like. I won't have an opportunity to talk about those two pieces maybe another time, but I wanted to set that up because there's a lot of implications for us locally. So who is a disadvantaged community? Our CLCPA required that a climate justice working group determine and dig through that definition. They are made up of environmental justice advocates and others. And they looked at issues like land use, pollution exposure, climate change risk, and came up with a definition for who is a disadvantaged community. So what I like to show, and I know Steve has seen this is a focus on, I work locally in New Rochelle, Yonkers, Mount Vernon. So this is just, this is the state identification of who is a disadvantaged community, just a snapshot of it. You see these heavy concentrations in New York City, north of New York City. Where I am, fully half of the town I live in, the entire southern half of New Rochelle, has been designated a disadvantaged community. And what that really means is that there's a very high incidence of both climate vulnerability and environmental burden as sifted through the state pursuant to the climate justice working group's work. That includes indicators like race, and it's really showing, some of the problems that we have, serious problems that we have on these issues in our state. So then I want to pivot a little bit, because you see we've got these frames. We've got this federal and state frame for who should get prioritization, or who should get at least benefit from these funds from this climate justice perspective. And then of course we had a little thing called the Inflation Reduction Act passed it's only been a few weeks, and it's a very, very, very big deal. This slide I think I took from Washington Post. There are different analyses in terms of who thinks what is going to energy and environmental justice. But if you look at this slide, there are direct appropriations for a national green bank. I'm involved in that piece too, but I can speak to that another time. To clean energy, specifically funding that's supposed to go to states, money that's supposed to go to environmental justice projects, and also work like environmental justice organizations or groups doing environmental justice work. But the vast majority of the funds really go to tax credits for for clean energy, like for heat pumps, like for solar, the stuff that we like to see. There are also a lot of bad things in the IRA, but what I want for folks to see is the scale, right? That $235 billion, that's a lot of money. So what happened at our last Climate Action Council meeting? One of the beautiful things about being out in front and leaders in New York is that we are ready, we are prepared with our analyses. And what the state unveiled are some of the initial analyses of what folks think the IRA will do in New York. And this is just one slide from the meeting. There's a much larger story. We're all looking to get under the hood in terms of like, what were the assumptions? What does this really mean? But what you see is this big number, right? $70 billion of incentives for New Yorkers through 2050. That is a huge, 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 huge number. And I think the imperative is, there's a lot, as I said, there's complexity in terms of how the federal government is defining disadvantaged communities, how the state is defining disadvantaged communities, what will our state officials do? How will they work with our local municipalities and making sure that we get these funds? But I think from an environmental justice perspective, certainly in my grassroots local environmental justice perspective, we are saying, what's going to be done here? What does benefit mean? And who's going to be at the table as these decisions are made? Are we going to see things like from the infrastructure law? Are we going to see more highways? Are we going to see more damage? Communities want to be at the table and have a say in how these funds are going to be spent and what these projects look like. And also, I think it's something I'm looking to do is really put a lot of pressure on all our officials, because we didn't get, we've been calling, as we know, our squad for a Green New Deal. We didn't get the Green New Deal that we may have wanted out of the IRA. In fact, there's a lot of troubling pieces to the IRA. However, this is the biggest investment in climate and energy provisions in United States history. So we're going to have to make a Green New Deal. We're going to have to be creative. We're going to have to, make sure that we get our fair share of these fundings, and that communities and environmental justice gets its fair share. And we're going to have to be creative. And how can we use these funds for community resilience, for greening our schools? How can we make sure this actually turns into the Green New Deal that we need? Because it's a huge priority, an unprecedented, once in a generation at this point anyway, priority in terms of funds and opportunity. So I really ask folks to urge your reps to fight for frontline communities and to include community voices in both CLCPA and Inflation Reduction Act implementation. I'll drop a link in the chat. I've got a letter going for anyone who wants to reach out to Representative Bowman, who's NYCD Council District 16. If you're in our region, I've got a letter tool. I urge you to use it. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and yield my time back to our moderator.
Hey, Raya, thank you for that very much. And I think I'll also mention that part of the Climate Action Council process, there was a separate comment period for the environmental justice piece that went statewide. And so within the Climate Action Council, some of these issues have gotten some priority. And now, as you say, we want to see how that gets delivered. So we will stay focused. I'm now going to move to Gavin Donohue, who I've known for a long time, back to his days when he was at DEC and other places in state government. And he's been a very effective leader of the Independent Power Producers of New York and an active member of the Climate Action Council. So Gavin, welcome aboard. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Assemblyman, and I appreciate all your leadership and help on a lot of these issues and other issues that are important to us. Bob, I want to make sure that in a small panel like this that I'm not redundant and repetitive of other speakers, because I think Bob hit the highlights and so Raya hit the highlights on a number of things. I mean, just setting the table, I represent the power producers of the state. I represent over 3/4 of the power plants that keep the lights on across the state. We employ almost 15,000 people across the state and pay somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.5 billion to $1.7 billion in property taxes. I think we have a long record of environmental stewardship while delivering electricity. Just a couple highlights here. We've reduced carbon in the last 20 years by 60% in New York State. We've reduced NOx and SOx some 98%. And quite frankly, when I was at DEC, I was a big part of a lot of these policies and very proud of my personal and professional background on this stuff. I think what I would say is some benefits with this climate council and the fact that we're all here today. This has made, while Peter and I went to college together, we both attended Siena College. We probably haven't worked that closely together. Raya, Bob, this climate council and the collaboration has forced a number of people that generally don't work together or maybe oppose each other to actually sit in a room and talk about how do we accomplish and decarbonize our economy. And as it was mentioned, this is the #1 decarbonization policy in the country. It is very complicated. It's going to impact every part of our lives. And I think that's been an incredible benefit of this process. Raya is right. The disadvantaged community piece of this is critically important. The environmental justice issues need to be addressed. There's communities that are sustaining pollution every day. We need to figure out how to fix these problems and devote resources to those areas to do that. But I guess what's driving me in the council is issues around reliability, affordability, and the cleanliness aspect of it. So there's those 3 principles. Reliability is paramount. We need to have a reliable electricity system. I watch California on a daily basis. What's going on in California the last few weeks? Governor telling folks to increase their thermostat to 78 degrees, you plug in your electric car after 9 o'clock at night. I don't think those are the policies that we really want in New York. We want to have a good, reasonable, clean energy transition. We want to bolster reliability. Oil and gas, hugely important today to our economy. For the listeners here and the folks participating may not be aware of it, 75% of our electricity in New York City and the lower Hudson Valley is generated on a daily basis by oil and gas. How do we get off oil and gas as a state and an economy and do that is incredibly complicated, and it is really important that folks understand that we're just not going to be able to transition off this like flicking your switch. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort. The issue of costs are huge. We all talked today about inflation, high gas costs. Folks are struggling to pay their bills. I have pushed from the beginning, before we implement some of these policies, that we need to know what the study will be, what consumers will pay to accomplish these programs. One of the downsides of the CLCPA bill itself, it does not include any direct funding to deal with these programs. Yeah, there's state programs at NYSERD and other places to help folks, but we don't have a way to pay for this outlined in this legislation. That is a big deal. When you talk about retrofitting a house, as Bob talked about earlier, with heat pumps, but to accomplish the requirements of the law, there's estimates it's $25,000 to $50,000 a household to do that. Somebody's got to pay for that. So we need to know what we're talking about. The thing that we also didn't talk about today, and it's a big issue, and I know it's a big issue in Hudson Valley, is transmission. We are building these renewables, these other innovative technologies upstate New York. If we can't get the transmission lines and get the product to the market, I think that's failed policy. So we need to build out the transmission system. The estimates in this climate council are today's electricity grid needs to be built out 4.5 times larger than it is today. That's a big undertaking, a lot of details and complexities around that. The last thing I'd like to just talk about is zero emission resources. Where I think we're short-sighted in this plan is we talk about wind, solar, and storage, and they're critically important. And I represent a lot of solar and wind, but what we need is zero emitting dispatchable resources. If we're going to get off my comment earlier about oil and gas, what we need is the state to determine under the law what is a innovative zero emission technology to keep the lights on 24 hours a day. This is not my talking point. This is the ISO's talking point. We need to have that type of resource. Is it hydrogen? Is it renewable natural gas? What technology is out there so that we can be a leader in the country and attract that private investment that ultimately will lower costs? So the failure of the plan to acknowledge or identify that resource is very troubling to me. And I agree totally with what Bob said too about an education campaign. We had a lot of public comment, but believe me, I think we go a long way, because I don't think the general public really realizes the breadth and magnitude of this law. And how you deal with EJ communities, keeping a reliable, affordable electricity grid is going to be critically important. We need to come up with necessary funding. I think Raya was right. The Inflation Reduction Act is going to provide a lot of money for New York State, and that's a good thing. We need to put it to good use. And how we deal with buildings and cars, because that's where the lion's share of our carbon emissions are today. So I'll stop there and be prepared to answer any questions. We just need the state to execute in a smart way. So thank you for the opportunity, Steve, and it's great to be with my fellow colleagues.
Gavin, thank you very much. And we already have a few questions in the chat that we will fin in at the end. But I would say that if you have questions, put them in the chat and we'll see what we can get in between now and 1:55. Peter, environmental advocates is a long history and is a great force in Albany. The floor is yours, and give us your take on where we are with the Climate Action Council and where we're going.
Yeah, thanks, Assemblyman Otis. Great to be with you again, longstanding member of the State Assembly's Environmental Conservation Committee, and also a member of the Climate Change Task Force that one of the first active Speaker Carl Hastie created when he created the task force when he became Speaker. So good to be with you all. Good to be with you, Raya, Gavin, Bob Howarth. One of the things I want to begin on is to address some of the issues that I think a lot of people in communities across New York are going to be grappling with, is how local governments is going to play a real key role in the success of this law. If you've had any time to thumb through the draft climate plan that's been out since the beginning of this year, key piece of that is a chapter on local governments, and it will be really pivotal, I think, the successful law and how local governments, play a role in affecting the change. And here's a couple of examples, because I know all of you are working very hard as community leaders, either in local governments or with local governments, to shape this. But when you think about land use, when you think about code enforcement, even zoning, all of these are key pieces of how we're going to successfully transition away from combustion of fuels and into an economy that is completely electrically driven. And all those electrons won't have any emissions with it. I know a lot of people like to sort of use shorthand about carbon pollution and decarbonization, but the climate law is more than just addressing climate change. As Raya sort of talked about the disadvantaged communities, the reason why I wholeheartedly agree with the way the New York Times characterized this law when it was signed in the summer of 2019 was, this is the world's most ambitious climate plan, because not only does it address greenhouse gas emissions, but this law also requires all of state government to prioritize the reduction of co-pollutants of combustion, meaning oxides of nitrogen, soot particles, sulfur oxides, all of those other things that are emitted when we combust fuels, either in motor vehicles or in power plants. The state has to prioritize emissions reductions there in disadvantaged communities. So there are a lot of key pieces of this, and an important role that local government's going to play. And I will say also that the law requires that the electrons that are feeding into our electrical system be devoid of emissions. The law is pretty clear. It says zero emissions for 2040. So the electricity sector will be completely 100% emissions free by 2040. That will then feed all of the electrically powered systems. And just one other thing to sort of just recall as you're working with local governments as they think about this, this isn't required to happen overnight. We need steep reductions to occur under the law within the next 7 years. If we have any shot of hitting our goals from an ecological perspective, we need to have our emissions by 2030. And that's what the law requires. And there's a heavy emphasis on renewable resources to be installed by 2030 to help us get there. And these are really key pieces that I wanted to just sort of draw out in the conversation, because the enormous benefits that will accrue to New Yorkers are first and foremost economic. Failing to act and not addressing this crisis is more costly than actually acting and installing heat pumps and switching over to electric cars and transitioning our entire electric generating sector to renewables. If we sit and ignore the problem and don't act, it costs us all more than if we act. And that's something that I really just want to allow you to sort of think about a little bit. So the climate action plan is a social and racial justice piece. It is an environmental piece, and it's just smart economics for New Yorkers to sort of embrace this change moving forward. And I'm part of the can-do chorus. I really want to sort of lean into the fact that I think over the years, American ingenuity, our skilled workforce, have always beaten environmental standards when they've been laid out. I'm going to give you two quick examples to talk about cost and environmental performance. Almost 30 years ago, New York State, and Gavin will remember this as a state official at the time, New York State decided very boldly to maintain its reliance and adherence to the California clean car rules. And I remember in 1995 when Governor Pataki was sort of weighing to stay in or not, the car makers came to us all in New York and said, if you require us to meet this standard, it is going to cost $1,000 extra per car, and we're not going to be able to sell gasoline-powered cars. We're going to have to make them all natural gas-powered. We didn't believe that as environmentalists. Governor Pataki didn't believe it at the time. And thankfully, American ingenuity found a way to beat that standard for far, far less than what the industry told us in 1995. And here is what it cost to meet that standard back in that time. $80 extra per car. And nobody had to, have their vehicles being natural gas. It was just simply moving the catalytic converter to a different position. When I bought that car that was $80 extra, they were going to charge me more for floor mats. So listen, American ingenuity and know-how always rises to the occasion with technological advancements to beat emission standards when government puts them in place. And when it comes to cost, I think Raya really eloquently laid out sort of the huge advantages that New Yorkers will be able to take with the Inflation Reduction Act that was just passed, and the council is looking at those numbers. And I'm just going to give you a personal example of how that will play out over time and how it will draw down the costs for those who are able to take advantage of it sooner rather than later. I installed more solar panels on my home this summer. And there was an initial price that came in. I installed them. And when I file my taxes next year and take advantage of both state and federal incentives, that cuts the install price in half. So when you think about sort of cost of these technologies, there are a lot of resources that are available right now to New Yorkers with the NYSERDA incentives and tax policy that exists now. And that's only going to become more generous when the federal laws kick in at the beginning of the year. So that's a real interesting sort of thing to be thinking about. Now, getting back to my initial point before I wrap up, local governments are going to play a key role. As I mentioned, land use decisions, code enforcement, working with developers in terms of making sure that new developments are devoid of fossil fuels and fully electric, and things like zoning. I participate personally on my volunteer time with a local group in the town of Bethlehem. And we were very active in the last 2 years of helping to shape the town of Bethlehem's comprehensive plan. And it is 5 miles just south of the state capitol. And I'm happy to say that they aligned that comprehensive plan with the foresight of knowing that the climate law is going to require a whole different way of thinking about land use, planning, and indeed zoning. And here's how detailed you have to be thinking about and pushing at the local level on zoning. I'm not sure how many people knew this, and I certainly didn't know this. And as Steve mentioned earlier at the outset, I was acting commissioner of DEC at one point. I've spent 30 years in this business. But I did not realize up until earlier this year that New York State, the DEC, plays no role in the siting of retail gasoline stations. If the local government allows that in zoning, then somebody can come in and build a new gasoline station. Now, we're going to move the entire transportation sector to electric vehicles very rapidly. The market's moving there. We don't need any new gasoline stations in New York, yet they're being built time and time again in communities across New York because local zoning still allows them. The only role that the state plays is when they get a piece of paper from the people who have built these gasoline stations that tell them where the underground tanks are. So local governments are really on the leading edge of sort of really thinking about stopping fossil fuel infrastructure, ensuring that building codes are being met and met up to the most robust standards that will be being changed, but also thinking about how we change land use and comprehensive planning so that our communities are designed to live, work, and play with the knowledge that by 2050, we are going to have a completely electrified economy in New York State that is devoid of burning any fossil fuels or any fuels for that matter. The nice thing about it is we've given ourselves ample time. We're not flipping a switch to turn this on overnight, and we've given ourselves, a lot of runway to play with to take this new economy off the runway and lift it up. So I will wrap up there by saying thanks again for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to some good Q&A now.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you all. So we have a few questions in the chat, and the first one that came in is an environmental justice question about how do you incentivize communities that are not environmental justice communities to participate in some of this funding. I'll offer this to Raya if she wants to comment. It seems to me, though, that there's plenty of money for all these, for every community to be doing good things. But Raya, do you have a comment on that question in the chat? Maybe we lost Raya. So lacking that, I'm gonna move on. I'll stick with my answer, which is I think from a community perspective, there are going to be funding opportunities that communities of all sorts are going to have to show the interest in applying and changing their own design of what they do to meet some of the funding opportunities coming from the state or the federal government. The next set of questions we have, and I'm going to open this up to any of you. We have a few questions on the transmission systems. One is why transmission systems rather than distributed generation? Another question on transmission is what is the impact of expanding transmission systems on the environment in other areas? So I'll offer that to, why don't we start with Professor Howarth? Do you have any comments on the nuts and bolts of transmission system issues?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Two great questions. I agree with what Gavin said, that we do need to increase our transmission capabilities in the state. We have a very old system, and in the interest of resiliency and redundancy, and to get more renewable energy into particularly New York City, but throughout the state, I think we need some improvements there. However, we also need to go with the distributed grid system. So it's not an either or. We need both, and I think we should do both as hard as we can. As to the environmental consequences of these transmission lines, there can be consequences when you clear a long area. We clearly want to do as little damage as we can. We want to use existing right-of-ways to the extent we can. We want to use the best technologies that are out there. So I think we need to proceed that way, and I think we should do so as carefully as we can, but also quickly. There's some urgency to move this along.
Gavin, do you want to feed into that question?
I agree with Bob. I think it's not just one technology over another. All solutions need to be on the table on transmission. And I also agree with the point Peter made. The local government aspect of this is critically important. We are a home rule state. It is a tough state to do business, whether you're a private company or some other industry, and local government involvement and commitment to this is going to be really important on success. Bob's right, we haven't built a lot of transmission in the state for a very, very long time. It's needed, but again, you're going to have local home rule and local input that makes it controversial So we need to move quickly, but we need to move smartly. And there's no doubt about it. I think everybody agrees on the Climate Council that the investment in transmission is a necessary component if we're going to have any chance of having any success here.
Thank you, Gavin. Peter, there's a question in the chat related to something that you were referencing in a different way, which was the conflict between ground source heat pumps and maybe other kinds of technologies and some of the local zoning codes. And what can we do to break down some of those roadblocks where maybe codes are not modernized enough to even allow some of the basic alternative renewable kinds of technologies that are out there?
Yeah, so the first thing is the legislature passed a bill this year, and I hope it gets signed into law. Well, actually, it did get signed into law by your colleague, Pat Fahey, which I know you voted for, Steve, that would help modernize building codes. So we'll have, up-to-date building codes for not only buildings, but also appliances. And I think, the folks who are here with us today that are very influential communities should be going to their town boards and their planning boards and having them, examine what's been going on at the Climate Action Council and have a deep appreciation for the need to modify zoning and building codes so that they're not in conflict with where this climate law is taking us. Again, the law is going to move us completely off of combustion of fuels for all of our energy sources, all of our personal energy sources, industrial sources, and how we generate power. So this is the moment in time where people should be going to town governments, going to city governments, going to county governments, and making sure that there aren't barriers to progress going in. Bob mentioned something very early on in his talk. I want to uplift that again, and looking at networked systems for ground source heat pumps. That is now going to be allowed. The natural gas companies are allowed now under law that was passed this year to get involved in other aspects of business. Instead of just moving gas, they can move network geothermal. We need to make sure that there aren't any barriers to do that, because it's a highly efficient way to sort of share the costs, but also to generate heat and power for homes without combustion. We got
Thank
you on mute.
Peter. We have a few questions in about community solar and solar as how to best evolve those technologies. Gavin, why don't I throw that at you first? Some of your members are in the solar space as well.
Yeah, we are in the solar space. We like to build solar. There's a lot of money out there and incentives to build the solar programs. I think folks are taking advantage of it. But like everything else in the state, somebody doesn't like it. It is highly, controversial. Putting up a wind farm is controversial. So doing solar at the local level is important. Community solar programs in areas where we have a lot of population are critically important to help us move the needle. So it gets back to Bob's point earlier, and something I think I've tried to emphasize. It's part of the solution to this, and needs to be part of the solution. And we should be looking at innovative solutions and all technologies as a way to help achieve our goals. So I view community solar as important as any other aspect of this plan.
Bob, do you want to feed in on the solar issue?
No, not particularly, but let me step back a little bit to the heat pump issue. And I mentioned briefly this neighborhood idea, and Peter stressed that again. It is definitely a very efficient way to bring very efficient heating into people's homes at the community scale. And it's now allowed by law. I think it's an important way to go forward. And let me just point out that if one of the things we've been discussing in the council, I don't think we've resolved it entirely yet. As we move to beneficial electrification in the future, everyone will be heating their homes with electricity, with heat pumps. If the entire state uses air source heat pumps, those work, and they work just fine in our cold climate, but in the depths of winter, they are not anywhere near as efficient as ground source heat pumps. And so if we allow the state to move mostly to the ground source as opposed to more to the air source as opposed to the ground source, we actually need much more electric capacity and much more dispatchable storage than if we encourage the ground source pumps. And so to the extent that there are barriers at the local level that would interfere with ground sources, we really need to make sure that doesn't happen. I think we should be pushing hard to make ground source heat pumps at the community scale where possible, sort of our priority approach.
Yeah, and Steve, I can add a bit on the community solar.
Great, Raya, go right ahead.
You know, and thank you, Bob, because you really raised one of the main barriers to community solar in New York State and across the nation really are regulatory issues. And they relate to sort of the way that utilities do business. And you know, some resistance by many utilities to distributed, you know, power, period. But, you know, when you're talking about a school, a community center, a church that may be looking to do community solar, where they have their generating capacity above their own need and could potentially use that power to another location, perhaps across the street or other right of way, you run into tremendous regulatory barriers that really are based on the outdated utility business model. A lot of the community solar we do is done through virtual net metering and other ways. But I think there's some fundamental issues with how we can have more distributed power, and that will also be an important conversation. And what Bob is talking about, a key solution of district heat pumps, if that's a way to say it, and on the neighborhood or community level.
That's great, Raya. Two other questions that came in the chat, and we're getting closer to our closeout time. One is, how can we assure that alternative energy solutions are ecological, which is sort of an open-ended question. And then another question from Tompkins County regarding the lack of qualified code enforcement officers to deal with a lot of the code issues that address the issues that we're talking about. So I'll open that up to the four of you. You could comment on one or both of those, and any closing comments. We have really probably 5 minutes left.
Let me start off with the ecological approach. I'm an ecologist by training. I care about ecology. We need to make sure that whatever we do is done in the most environmentally benign, most environmentally friendly way. But climate change is so terrible for human health, for society, but also for ecological functioning. And so it is critical that the world move quickly towards these sort of solutions that we're pioneering here in New York. And I believe we can do so while being as kind as we can in the technologies we apply. We need to take care to do that, but they shouldn't be used as an excuse not to start to make the transitions.
Thank you.
Maybe
Go on, Ryan.
I said, no, I agree with Bob. And I also, it's extremely important that we dig in on, what the standards are for, be it the, for the batteries, for the other raw materials that go into clean energy. And it's really critical that that there are labor standards, that there are ethical standards included with that. And I don't want to make it an either or, but it's like we need those kind of standards across the board for fossil fuels that we hope will be pivoting away, but across the board. So while this is extremely important, while myself and many others want to move away from extractive industries, and there are extractive industries at the heart of a lot of clean energy technologies, I think we want to back up and not take our eye off the ball in terms of how the ethical standards and the extraction and the carbon intensity for all the products that we have, including the clean energy products, and how we can reduce the harms from these sectors.
Thank you, Raya. Why don't we close out with Gavin and then Peter?
Just real quickly, I mentioned this at the beginning. We need to come up with something to replace natural gas. There's just no doubt about it, and we need the reliability to do that. I just looked, today statewide, 50% of our electricity is being utilizing oil and gas across the state. It's a challenge, a huge challenge, and we need to figure out what innovative zero emission technology is out there. So I'm sorry I keep harping on it, but the state has to come to grips with that because we can't have a reliable system without it. And as it pertains to something Peter started out with local government and the question around code enforcement, worker training and safe worker training programs are critically important to our safety, or to the reliability and the success of this program. So as important as all this energy and emission reductions are, having properly trained workers, whether it's a code enforcement officer or someone working on a solar panel, is critically important. We didn't talk a lot about that today, but that is a big issue on the labor side. How do you train folks to actually work in this new environment in a responsible and effective, safe way? So that's something I would like to close out with. Thank you.
Great comment. Peter? the
Yeah,
final word is
I'll be
yours.
brief because I know we're butting up against the end here. I'll just sort of say that Gavin mentioned this earlier, that the climate law does not have a quote pay for a revenue stream for it, but the council is closely examining a couple of policies that can generate some revenues, because every chapter of the climate action plan has recommendations of things that need to get funded. And funding and supporting local governments is going to be critically important. They're going to need resources for code enforcement. They're going to need resources to do comprehensive planning, and the state should be providing, the support of local governments, because it's a critically important piece of the success of the law. My last quick comment is just a little slight quibble, but I always kind of am amused when people call harnessing the energy of the sun as quote alternative. I sort of think of like extracting fossil fuels, blowing up mountaintops, fracking, being beholden to oil cartels across the seas for oil prices. I mean, that's alternative. Harnessing the energy of the sun that has been around well before all of us and will be around well after all of us should be sort of just the basic, simple way of going forward. It can be done in many, many different ways without emissions. So small little editorial comment at the end. Hope that wraps us up nicely.
Well, Bob, Gavin, Ryan, Raya, and Peter, thank you. You've been a great panel, and more importantly, thank you for all the time that you put in on the Climate Action Council with all the other things that you are doing in your primary responsibilities. That is a major responsibility of your time and efforts to help steer our state in the correct direction. I'll ask everyone to move on to the next workshops of their choice. And thank you so much, our panelists, for great contributions and great help to our conservation audience around the state. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.